Hello. Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this new edition of PHP Sussex. My name is Yannick, and if this is your first time at PHP Sussex, we are a Brighton-based user group dedicated to the PHP programming language and to web development in general. We gather once a month, usually on the second Wednesday of the month. In a minute, I will be joined by tonight's speaker. Her name is Gina Banyard, and she's a PHP Core Developer, which basically means that a full-time job is to work on PHP, which is pretty cool. And Gina, among other things, is the lead maintainer of the French version of the PHP documentation. And tonight, Gina is going to take a deep dive into PHP's type system. And I'm very much looking forward to this. Before we do this, though, first, a reminder that this event is being recorded. So if you do not want to be filmed or photographed, please do let us know. And then before we get started, Charlie is going to tell us a few words about Runway East and Silicon Brighton, who kindly support this meetup tonight. Over to you, mate.
Thank you, mate. Let me dash across to the other side here.
Clicker.
Thank you so much. Yes, my name's Charlie. For those of you I've not had the pleasure to meet yet, I work in events and community engagement for Silicon Brighton. And I've got a bit to say about us, but before I get into that, I just want to say a massive thanks to Runway East, this amazing space where we're at this evening, who not only gift us this awesome event space, but also pay for the pizza this evening. So we really, really appreciate them. They are, I believe, on a mission to get rid of boring workspaces. I think that's what they say their purpose is, which is pretty cool. And yeah, I mean, this space is absolutely awesome. They've got like offices all throughout the building for different sizes of companies. It's fantastic. And yeah, like I say, I work with Silicon Brighton. We are the host of Brighton and Hove's tech sector, and we support over 30 different meetup groups across the city in the tech and digital sector, including PHP Sussex. And all the events that we run are free to join, available to people at all levels, and they're all hybrid. So you can all join us in the room here or watch the live stream on YouTube and then watch a video of the event afterwards if you would like to as well. None of the work that we do would be possible without the help of our amazing supporters, all of whom you can see here. If there's a company who you know who might be interested in supporting us, who you can't see on this list, maybe point them in our direction. We would really appreciate it. And we're always looking for more help supporting the different meetup groups, either help by giving a talk or come and volunteering at an event, or helping an organizer run the group. Anything that you might be interested in doing, please come and if you have any interest in doing so, come have a chat with myself or Yannick at any point. We would really appreciate it. These are our values. I'll let you read through these whilst I'm speaking, but the most important thing to know about these is that if you feel they're not being upheld at any point in any of the work that we do, please just let me know immediately. You can follow us on socials, all at Silicon Brighton on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter /X, and TikTok. And you can come to some of our upcoming events, which you can or check out the full calendar at siliconbrighton.com/events. But tomorrow there is People and Culture Club. Imagine Pizza and Culture Club. What a group. People and Culture Club, not to be confused. And then next week here at Runway East again is Green Software Brighton, People Planet Pint, and JavaScript Brighton on the same night as well. So you can do the double if you fancy it. We have an amazing Slack community where you can stay in touch with everybody you meet at the events and more people as well. It's a great place to connect with people and share resources. And if you scan this QR code, I believe that will take you to the PHP Sussex meetup page. But if not, type PHP Sussex into Google and join the meetup page so you can be notified when all of the events get posted. That's everything from me. Thank you guys very much for coming. We really appreciate it. I'm going to hand back over to Yannick and to Gina.
Thanks, Charlie. Gina, how are you doing?
Yes, hello. Hello, everybody. I'm doing fine. Actually, nice weather here in Brighton compared to London from where I actually live. So
Always super nice weather in
looking
Brighton.
forward to it. But yeah.
First of all, thank you for being here. We're super happy to have you with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure. Before we get started with your talk, I would like to ask you about your job, actually.
Yes.
So, PHP Core Developer. Ooh, there's a bunch of people who are about to cross the room. That's going to be something. And more specifically, I would like to ask you about how one becomes a PHP Core Developer. So how did that happen for you?
Okay, I think there are like multiple ways how you become a PHP Core Developer. Sometimes it's because you just want to like fix a bug, which is really annoying, or like, and so you go into deep dive and just goes and fix it. Other people, it just scratches an itch. They feel like, oh, I would like a feature. Like I use this other programming language and this would be useful. So they start doing this. For me, it's more about fixing stuff. So I initially started contributing to the French translation of the documentation. And when I started, I think back in 2017 or 2018, it was pretty outdated. So I went through a lot of files, updating a lot of the documentation. And you come across like sentences, which is like, wait, really? PHP does this? This is really strange. And various things like this, where I was like, okay, I would kind of like to change this because I find this is pretty dumb. So you then go into like looking how you can contribute, and then you learn it's like written in C, but it's not really. It's its own macro-based language, which is based in C. So it's a bit of a, sometimes makes it easy, but also makes it complicated because it abstracts away some stuff. Like you don't really have a for each loop in PHP, like in C normally,
Right. Yeah.
but you have one in PHP. But also in the PHP source code, you also have kind of a for each, because like we have like all of these macros, which will just iterate over entries of a dictionary and just do it for you. So it's kind of interesting.
Was that like your entry point to then get
Yes.
a job as a
So
PHP Core developer?
I initially tried to deprecate short tags, which caused a bunch of drama. Which kind of was accepted, but then not. But yeah, that's how I basically got in and just started throwing stuff and see what sticks at PHP, trying to like hack it that way. So that's basically how I did it.
And how do you go from there to being employed by the PHP Foundation?
Well, I think it's kind of reminding that the foundation is like pretty young.
Yes.
So it's like, well, I think like we're like in our third year, basically, barely.
Something like that, yeah.
And so I was already contributing to PHP, and when the foundation came to be, there was like a round of application that like one applied to, and I think they picked basically people that already worked on PHP, did the core. Like I mean, Derek Ressens, which is the also Vegas debug, like applied and started working as well at the same time as me. Ilya, who introduced like the match statement in 8.1, I think so.
Yeah.
Also started like working because it was doing a bunch of stuff at the same time. Arnaud Leblanc, who implemented whole of generics in PHP Stan, and like finds all of the weird stack bugs and memories and op cache.
Right.
So it were people who were already kind of involved
Okay.
that basically applied and got accepted to a limited number because of like funding and everything. We had like an application round last year where people like applied to be hired by the foundation.
Right.
We,
So
like,
there were like job openings published and people would apply. And,
so we like accepted 4 people. I'm not sure it's happening this year again. I think like funding is a bit of a struggle. So it's trying to maintain the funding for like the currently 10 people that are hired from part-time to like me, like full-time. But it is of varying degrees. So I think a lot of times when we start, you first given like about 1 day a week max to work, to mainly see, if you're compatible, if you work, what you can do, like does it work, and like what do you produce. But yeah, I think more people helps, so that we don't need to focus on everything at the same time. I think like some of the new hires, so Saki who's from Japan, like
Yes.
did a lot of stuff on like all of the database drivers, which is great because I don't understand databases.
Right.
So having somebody that actually works on MySQL, like Firebird or like Postgres, and tries to like fix those issues is pretty important because not all of us are specialists in every aspect of like PHP because
she talks about it on Mastodon, right? Because I follow her and it's super interesting what she talks about.
Yes.
Cool, super nice. So basically, if I understand correctly, probably if there were more funding, there would probably be more people working with the PHP Foundation.
I think it's also,
so if you want to put a word in with your companies, guys.
Yes, that would be helpful. I think like, I mean, the usual thing is like, yes, you could also like, I mean, some people do it as an individual. You can always like finance the PHP Foundation, but it's the more important people are like the companies because like you'd think it's more of an insurance policy because if the PHP Foundation doesn't exist, then it's unlikely there'll be people to work on it. So before the foundation, there were like 2 people that were employed full-time to work on PHP. So Dmitry Stogov, who created Opcache or created the JIT compiler, basically on his own, which is just like madness. Like that's one smart brain. And Nikita Popov, who was hired by JetBrains after university. But he decided he wanted to do something else and leave. So he now works on LLVM, which is which is like on the compiler toolchain for C, Rust.
I didn't think it was really maintained anymore. Okay, I'm surprised. But
but I mean, LLVM is massive, and like you see him just commit stuff. I mean, he did his first proposal to amend the C standard specifications, so that's also something.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, so that was also part of the reason why the foundation started to exist because it became from like, okay, we have 2 people that were paid to work on the language. Now we have 1. What happens if something happens to them?
Yeah, makes sense.
So now with the foundation, we are like about 8 people that actually work on the C code. Like we have like 2 which are more like support, like Shivam, which you might use if you use all of the GitHub actions that he maintains. Yeah. He helped us with to work on like CI, get like the Windows extensions back up and running because the DDLs were not being built for like a year and a half after Microsoft decided to pull the plug on their machine and on support for that. And then we have like James, forgot his surname, Asgrim on all of the socials, who works with Rove, who's part of creating a new Pecco replacement, which is, I think the official name is Pi, to be able to install extensions in a with versioning in a more using like part of the composer infrastructure as well. I
think the creation of the foundation was very welcome by most of the community at the time. Cool. Thank you for shedding some light on all of this. But I'm going to let you get on with your talk now.
Sure.
So please welcome Gina for a talk, PHP's type system dissected.
I just need to do some juggling around. Okay. Yes. PHP type system dissected. If you take every initial of the word, you'll get like an acronym, and this is what sometimes happens to me. But yeah. So you can find me on Mastodon. So @php.social. Technically, I'm also on Twitter or X. Terrible name, but I don't really use it. I studied pure mathematics at Imperial College London. So I'm a PHP Core Developer founded by the foundation. I care a lot about type systems, and I care about PHP semantics, because PHP sometimes is very weird, but we'll get to that at the end. So table of contents. So yeah, like what PHP type system, subtyping and LSP, and then type coercion and juggling in PHP. So a type system is a logical system comprising a set of rules that assign a property called a type to every term. And a type system dedicates the operations that can be performed on a type. So for example, a type is an integer, and on an integer you can do addition, subtraction, you can divide, you can multiply, and on a string you can do concatenation, and things like that. And or like on a list you can do appending. So this is what like the operations that the type allow you to do. So the available types are in PHP. So we have like, we group them in atomic types, which are a single unit, which we have primitive types, user types, singleton types, and the weird special callable type. We have composite types, and then we have like one type alias natively in PHP. There's a bit of type theory terminology mixed with it. So the universal type, which is called mixed in PHP. So every single value in PHP is part of mixed. So null is part of mixed, and integer is part of mixed, any class is part of mixed. And this is available since PHP 8.0. The resource type doesn't actually have a type declaration in PHP. The main reason for that is so that it allows us to migrate resources to opaque objects. You might ever encounter this in PHP 8.0 when we converted like curl resources to like a curl handler object. I think we did this also with sockets. I think we're mainly missing I think 4 or 5 resources. The main ones are streams, which probably won't happen until PHP 9. Object type, which encompasses every object, which exists since PHP 7.2. The hash table type, because arrays in a PHP array is not really an array if you look at it at the computer science definition of it. Then scalar types. So for PHP, a bool, an integer, a float, and a string is considered a scalar type. We have this thing called a unit type, which is null since 8.0, but only as part of a union. That's why the asterisk. Since 8.2, however, you can use it standalone. The empty type never, which basically means that your function never returns. So either it calls exit and exits the program, or it throws an exceptions, or it's just something like a while true loop, which never stops. And then we got like void, which is this weird special return type, because a function in PHP actually always returns a value. So if you try to assign the return value of a function which is void, you'll actually get null. So yeah, like void and null are kind of the same. The only distinction is if you're allowed to do return null, or you need to do return like semicolon, basically at the compiler level. So user-defined types, this is probably what you use most of the time, because this will like encode your domain logic and everything. So we call them class types as well in PHP, and like in the documentation, or if you use like doc blogs for static analyzers. So these are the interfaces, classes, and enumeration since 8.1. And we have like these 3 relative class type things, which is self. Okay, the logic, okay, I can use I want something of the same type as my object or my interface. I can have parent, which is the immediate parent of an object. This exists mainly because it's a keyword and it kind of works, but if you ever have a parent as a type, I would have questions. So don't do that. And static since PHP 8.0, which is a return-only type, which is a bigger constraint on self. It means that you need to return an instance of the same class your method was called on. So for example, if you have A, so A being the parent class and B being the child class, and A defines a method which like has a return type of static, and you call this method in class B, you must return an object of class B. Because that would be like, okay, I'm calling B something of object B, so I want something of object B back. Singleton types. So singleton type is a concrete subtypes of a type. So in PHP, we only have 2 of them, which are true and false. False, again, since 8.0, only with union types, kind of the same restriction as null prior to this, and true since 8.2. Yeah, warning, you can't actually define a singleton type in PHP like in userland. So if you want this, you create an enumeration instead. The callable type, the wonderful callable type. So type which represents a function. So basically something that you can actually call on, like a variable that you can call and pass arguments to. So it can either be a string of characters, so the function strlen, like if you do this, then you can actually call this, like if you assign strlen to a variable and actually call it, you can actually call the strlen function. An object method pair in an array, where like the first argument is the instance of the object you want to call the method on, which is the second argument. An object which implements the invoke magic method is also a passing of a callable, or a closure, which you can obtain with the new syntax since 8.1, which is strlen with 3 dots. The 3 dots are part of the syntax. They're just not replaced. It's the actual syntax. I would recommend that if you are on 8.1 and you want to get a closure, to use this syntax, because it helps static analyze, because like telling a string that this is a callable, it's hard to analyze because you would need to like look at the content of the string and everything. Whereas like a closure, it's immediately obvious that this is something you want to call. One caveat with callable as well, which is why getting a closure is preferable, is that you cannot define a class property to be callable, mainly because callable does not take into account its scope. So for example, if you could assign a value to be a callable and pass it along, but it would stop being callable in your scope. For example, if you want a method of a certain object, if you try to pass this to another object, you wouldn't be able to call it. So that's kind of the weird restriction, whereas closures don't have these problems. So composite types. So composite types is combining multiple atomic types together. I'll start with intersection types, which exist since 8.1, which say I want something of type A and of type B at the same time. A simple union type, which exists since 8.0, which is I want something of type T or of type U. We had a nullable type since 7.1 with the question mark form, which is equivalent to basically T pipe null. And then we have distinguished called DNF types, which is disjunctive normal forms, which is a canonical form of a logic formula. So it's applied in general in math or any like Boolean logic you can have. But it is a canonical form where you have a disjunction of conjunctions, meaning you have ors of ands. So I have X and Y or V and W. Not I have X or Y in brackets and some other stuff. So the form is always you have the intersections like in the brackets and you are like using union types of that. So why do we care actually about composite types? Here I use C for countable, the countable interface, T for the traversable interface, C and T to be a type, the intersection of countable and traversable, and then I have array on the side. So if I have a class which implements countable, the only thing it tells me is I can just call count on it. And if something like implements traversable, I can use a for each loop on it and traverse through all of the items. But countable and traversable, so the intersection type tells me, oh, I can use countable and I can use a for each loop on this object. And because array also supports this, because if an object implements countable and traversable, you kind of want it possibly to be a collection or imitate an array. So if you're only using these operations, well, you can accept either a countable and traversable object, or you could support an array, which is kind of where the DNF form types come into. The intersection of types gives us access to every API, which is provided by each type. So I can use count and I can use the for each, whereas the union of types gives us access only to the common API between each type. So if I have either something of type countable or an array, I can still only use countable because that's the only common thing between both types. Type aliases. So since PHP 8.2, PHP has a dedicated type alias, which is iterable, which is resolved at compile time to be traversable or array. Before it was its own pseudo primitive type. It is currently impossible to have type aliases in userland. There are various reasons why. Main reason is complicated. The other reason is resolving the type and type checking the moment you have it. And then it gets do you want the type alias to be only at the file level, or do you want it to be on the package levels? Which, considering PHP doesn't officially have packages, we only have namespaces, which are kind of the same, but not really. There are various reasons why type aliases are a bit tricky in PHP. Tiny bit of C code to explain how it works within the engine. So every value is called a zval. A zval has two important things, which has the actual value, which is encoded in, which is in the Zen value union type, and it has a type info, which tells you of what type the value is, which has is null, is false, is true, is long, is double, all the way to is resource. This is also why PHP exposes false and true as types, as singleton types. It's because the engine already considered them as separate types for itself. Main reason is for performance, because you don't need to basically load up a Boolean and check if it's true or false. You have it immediately from the type info. So yeah, the other internal structure related to types in PHP is the Zen type structure. This is mainly used for type declarations, return types, and all of this. So it's the type of a parameter, yeah, is represented by this thing, and it has a pointer to void, which basically means here's an address space, here's a blob of memory, and just trust me, I know what I'm doing. C is brilliant. And then we have a type mask, which is a bit mask of all of the primitive types, so which is kind of related to the previous thing, like is false all of this. We do some bit shifts with that, and then they become like a mask, and then we can say, oh, if something is either a long, double, and string, then we have like basically a bit mask of what would be 4, 5, and 6 shifted. So this allows us to like do fast checking for primitive types. And the pointer in question, this void pointer, is either a class name as a string, if it's only a single one in a union type, or it points to a list of types, which is basically just a list of Zen types with like the number of types in this list. So subtyping and list cost substitution principle, which you probably better know as like LSP, which is part of the solid, one of the like the L in solid. So in programming language theory, subtyping is a form of type polymorphisms in which a subtype is a data type that is related to another data type, the supertype, by some notions of substitutability. If S is of subtype of T, the subtype relation written either with like the less than with like the 2 dots of T, either S with the weird square thing of C, or either the S with the less than, but also with the 2 dots, means that any term of type S can safely be used in any context where a term of type T is expected. So LSP is a particular definition of subtyping, which is called strong behavioral subtyping, which was formulated by Barbara Liskov and Janet Wing in 1994. So it is 30 years to the dot. And the succinct formulation, it let phi of x be a property provable about object x of type T, then phi of y should be true for object y of type S, where S is a subtype of T. What the hell does this even mean? So LSP is a principle about the replacement of a type with another type such that the interactions before and after are not affected. So preconditions cannot be strengthened in the subtype, postconditions cannot be weakened in the subtype, invariance must be preserved in the subtype, and the history rule, which that is specific to list cost substitution principle, which is the constraints must be preserved in the subtype. So the compiler can check the preconditions, the postconditions, and the invariance. However, it cannot check the history rule. The history is kind of tricky in what it actually means. It basically means that you cannot bypass how a normal operation of the parent type would work. So if we say like we have a class which has a position, and it can, like, let's say a character which can walk and move a certain amount of steps, then if you subclass it and say, let's say like a runner, and you have it like method run, this method should not directly affect the property that is called like the speed or the position. It should call back to the parent type what it like, and call like walk multiple times to imitate a run, is more or less what it relates to, because you could break some of the assumptions the parent type makes about a data structure if you do not call this via this way. Another possible more easier way to view is that like LSP is like if you have a data pipeline, which a lot of programming is, you take some data, you process it over and over and over again, and then you get some output, is that like I can replace something in the middle by accepting more stuff and returning something more specific, which is weakening the preconditions and reinforcing the postconditions. So what it effectively means for signatures is that a method cannot add mandatory parameters. Parameter types of method must be contravariant, i.e. there must be a subtype. The return type of a method must be covariant, i.e. the parameter type must be a supertype. So I can say I accept an integer, or I accept an integer and a string. The return type must be covariant. So if I say I return a class of like a countable interface, I return something more specific that implements a countable. And property types must be co and contravariant. The way we phrase it this way is because PHP will allow you to do some changes between how you write the properties. If they functionally equivalent, then it will still accept them. So in general, S is a subtype of T if S intersects with a new type U, and S removes a type T from a union, a type Ti from a union of types T, T1 up to Tn. So some concrete examples. So I have a class, super1, which returns a union of T, S, U, and V. I can extend it and return a function which only returns U or V. This is more specific than the parent type. Same thing as before, I can have an intersection of A and B, and I can decide to return something which is A and B and C and D, so, i.e. it is more restricted in what it accepts. But this is not just also, like you can remove unions and add intersections, because you have like some weird rules here, like you have something of interface A and B, you have X which implements A and B, and Y which implements A and B. So if I say my parent type returns something of type A, it is valid for me to say, I only return X and Y. Like, because in all of the type universe of like A, I have my two blobs, which are X and Y, which are within the larger blob. Same thing with the intersection. I say I want something of A and B, so I have A here, I have B here, I live in this like intersection here, and X and Y live within this intersection. Thus it is more specific, even if I go from an intersection to a union type. Same thing with DNF types, is I can replace the A and B component with the X and Y and just have a union. And it also works the other way around. Now that one's probably more intuitive, is that like if I say, I have something of A and B, and I have X which extends A, well, obviously X is a subtype of A, so just X is a subtype of A and B, and then I add an intersection so it is more constrained. So yeah, futures of PHP's type system. Maybe function types is an idea. So instead of just accepting a callable where you can't tell like how many arguments it takes and what it returns as a value, would be to like encode this in as a function type. So this would be like, okay, I take two parameters, the first one of type integer, the second one of type string, and I return a Boolean. Generic types. Like I've been doing this talk for 2 years and we're still nowhere near. I mean, there's been progress like on the internal side, like Arnaud has been working on it. It just turns out it's very hard. But the second problem, which is hard, is trying to make it fast. So yeah. But the generic type basically is also called a template type in other languages, means instead of needing to have a collection, like a collection of animals and a collection of dogs and a collection of like cats, a collection of fish, everything, I can just have a generic object which parameterizes on the type that you specify it. So instead of needing to create dedicated classes for all of my different collection types, I can just have like this one generic collection and have a specific generic type that I do at like while I instantiate the collection. Like I said, user-defined type aliases, that would be kind of useful and nice. These are just two ideas of how maybe to write them. Yeah, type def numeric in float. That feels like how C does it, and I don't find it very intuitive because I always think like the first part is what I'm replacing it with, but I don't know. In-out parameters, that's more to fix a problem with references. So the idea would be if you say I have an in-out parameter of array, is that if I try to change the value of my value, it would raise a type error because it must be constrained to be an array. Because currently, I didn't put the example out. But currently, if you just have a reference, and it's like the ampersand and stuff in front of the V, you can't actually change the type of your reference that you're passing in because the type check is only done at function entry and not at function exit. So yeah, slightly problematic. So yeah, this is more, how do I call it? I call this my therapy session because I will just like rant to you about all of the weird things PHP does. So this is basically me and how it would probably look. So yeah, small audience question. You just need to raise your hand. Like, don't need to answer. It's like, who has heard about string types? Yeah, most people. Who knows what string type actually does? Oh, 2 timid hands, 3, 4. Okay. So currently there are like 10 type juggling contexts. Number 7 is slightly fixed since PHP 8.3. I did a bunch of work on it. Number 10, I am trying to get it fixed for 8.4. But yeah. So the string type juggling context is in the context where you're using echo, print, string interpolation, string concatenation. So yeah, you can just like Boolean gets cast to 1 automatically for true. However, false gets cast to an empty string. You can also use an array as a string where we'll just convert the array to array with a capital A, but also emit a warning. So yeah, like arrays are great, truly. The only thing which is actually sensible is an object which is not stringable, gives you a type error. That's actually cool. PHP actually sensible sometimes. The integral and string type juggling context is kind of weird because I don't know how many of you use bitwise operators on a daily basis, except for like setting parameters like curl options or other stuff, which are normally just integers. But you can actually do it on strings, where it does like an ASCII, like byte-wise, bitwise operator, and this gives you the different things. So yeah, so apparently the union of 1, 2, 3 and ABC or as a bitwise OR gives you like QRS. 1, 2, 3 and 1E3 gives you 1W3. But yeah, then PHP has this concept of a numeric string. So if you use an integer and then do an OR with it, it will if the string is numeric, it will then cast a string to a number and then do that. The same thing is true for 1E3 because that's an exponential notation. So that basically means like 10 to the power 3, which is 1,000. So yeah, bitwise was 36, apparently it's like 1,004. Same thing was true. Same thing was null. Null gets cast to 0. PHP has this kind of thing where like extensions can actually do operator overloading. So GMP is this arbitrary precision integer extension that exists in PHP. So I'm basically having 36 bitwise OR with like an integer 25. And it will just work, and it will give me a new GMP object, which tells me this is 61. This surprisingly also works with another extension, which is called tidy, which is meant to like clean up HTML. And for some weird reasons, it defines an integer cast. So you can also use it in bitwise operations. I don't know why you would do this. Now, however, if you try to use a string with an integer and a string is not numeric, then you actually get a type error. So that's nice. So yeah, the numeric type juggling is basically the same as previously, but it's for like arithmetic addition. So it's like instead of being string and integers, it's integers and float, and you have kind of the same shenanigans where like numeric strings are a thing. So yeah, 123 plus 1e6, like 1e3 is like, well, 1,123. All the way, also true gets cast to 1, null gets cast to 0, and yeah, you can use GMP and like the tidy object for reasons. So the logical time juggling context is the context where you use conditional statements, the ternary operator, or any logical operator. Now, this is basically casting something to a bool, which should always work, except it doesn't, because GMP, this is actually the only class that does this. And like the recoverable fatal error, like if you did programming in the PHP 5 errors, you would get loads of these. But like with PHP 7, like all of these were converted to exception, like to errors, like the error exception class. Naming in PHP, not as forte. But this is the only case where this like recoverable fatal error is still possibly to be omitted. And for very weird cases where like an object overwrites the Boolean cast but doesn't support it. So yeah, brilliant. This is basically my reaction the first time that happened. So comparisons, which is, well, just using a comparison operator. I did not know if you know, but you actually can use, we have two different operators in PHP, which is I suppose the standard one, which is like the exclamation mark, or with the two brackets, which is actually the official SQL ANSI way of doing a difference. But I don't think anybody does this. And yeah, the spaceship operator, which is the newest ones, which was added in PHP 7.0. So this table I've copied from the documentation, which tries to explain like how different types get compared to each other. So yeah, like null gets converted to an empty string if you try to compare it with a string. Bool and null with anything else converts by side to a Boolean, and then false is less than true because apparently Booleans have a like order. So objects, built-in classes can define their own comparisons. So you can actually compare date-time objects with this. And same classes compare properties, otherwise they're considered incomparable. String resources and integers and floats. Translate the strings and resources to numbers, then do the usual math. Arrays with fewer members is smaller. If the key from the first operand is not found in the second one, then they are incomparable. Otherwise, you compare each entry by value. An object with mix, object is meant to be always greater. An array with everything else is also meant to be always greater. So these are kind of the implications, is that like an array is less than true, because an empty array gets converted to false, and false compared with true is less than. The string 1 and the string 0.1 are the same because they both get cast to integers, which is brilliant. Like OE5 and OE9 are also the same because, again, exponential notation, so brilliant. The erasing is because the arrays are incomparable. PHP doesn't actually have a proper way of signaling this. So its way of doing it is to say, like, however you flip the operands, you always get the same result. I always like operand 1 is greater than the other one, which also works with, with trying to like compare like a standard class with something else. But then you have like some other like weird things where like GMP actually like works. Like if you use the class first to compare, then it gives you like the, I suppose, normal semantics of being incomparable. If GMP is actually the first one, then you get a type error. The reason for this is that when you do comparisons, the first object will use its compare handler to do the thing, and GMP is stricter than the default one. Everything is fine. You can compare an integer to a class, in which case it will try to cast a string to an integer. Also, this is just a notice, not even a warning. It's just like, yeah, sure, whatever, like, not there, not important. And yeah, like because of the same shenanigans where tidy implements an integer cast, it actually works, so you can compare them for reasons. GMP, like, weirdly, again, is because it implements its own compare handler, like accepts floating point numbers, but does not actually accept a numeric string because it's not an integer string. Why? Function type juggling. So this is the context when you pass a value to a type parameter, a property, or a return value from a function, which declares a return type. So in this context, the value must be a value of the type, except into float promotion. So you can pass any integer to a float argument, and this will work. The type and the values are scalars. Then the value gets converted to the appropriate type if it's compatible. And the string types accepts objects that are castable to strings. So kind of a note is that internal functions also would coerce null as a scalar type for declarations, but this was deprecated as part of 8.1. So you could pass null to like the function strlen, and it will cast null to an empty string and then tell you, well, this is 0. This will now give you a deprecation notice. So into float promotion is pretty self-explanatory. You get float, you pass in an integer, it gets cast to a float. Pretty simple. conversion for scalar types. So if you have multiple scalar types allowed, the order is the following. It will first try to use the integer, then the float, then a string, and then a Boolean. So yeah, if you have int or string and you pass it a float, it will use it as an integer for the moment, and you'll get a deprecation notice because you're getting an implicit conversion from float to int, which is, I think, since 8.1 that I added this. So yeah, basically telling you, like, oh, we're truncating the data. But in PHP 9, when it will stop being compatible with an integer, you'll get a string in this case, which I hope you don't use those union types too much, either explicitly or implicitly. So yeah, scalar types. So if you're passing a string to a type which accepts int or float, it will actually use its own numeric string semantics to determine to which type it should coerce. So yeah, 15.6 will not get truncated to 15. It will just pass as a float, and 25 will pass as an integer. Notice how I said string castable objects and not stringable objects, which is like an interface which exists since 8.0, which where like you can use like a string and it will get cast to, well, a class which has a toString message and will get cast to a string and it works fine. Again, our lovely friend, the GMP extension, just decides to do it differently. So it does not implement stringable. It does not have a message to string, yet you can cast it to a string without any worries. So yeah, the increment and decrement operators. Oh, joy. So actually, this is mostly fixed, in quotes, in 8.3, because that RFC passed, and you'll get a bunch of warnings. So some of the cases I'll show you. But yeah, with integers and floats, it does what you would expect it to do. It just adds one, it removes one, standard. PHP took a feature from Perl, which is a string increment. So you can increment a string. So yeah, so DZ, like Z overflows to A, and then you give in the carry. So DZ++ is equal to EA. That's sensible. Now, arrays and like resources and actually do not support this. Booleans will not show any warning, but they do nothing. Like you can increment or decrement them, but you'll still get the same value because sure, why not? So yeah, so for strings, if the string is numeric, it gets converted to a number, and then it does it. So yeah, so your string 10 gets converted to 10, and then you get a +1, so you get 11. And the same thing with floats. So again, GMP like has a object overloading, so that works. Tidy does not. Even though you can cast it to an integer, it used to throw an error. It doesn't anymore in PHP 8.3. If you try to decrement null, you just get null, like it doesn't change anything. If you try to increment null, you get 1, because why not? This will now also emit a warning since 8.3 to tell you that like this will change in the future. So you cannot decrement a string except the empty string, where that you get like the number -1. However, if you try to increment the string, well, like I said, you got the string increment, but the empty string incremented, you get the string 1. Not the integer 1, you get the string 1, which then if you re-increment it again, you will get the integer 2. Great, brilliant, makes perfect sense. So the Perl string increment only actually works with ASCII characters. So yeah, it doesn't accept like E acute. So yeah, Z overflows to AA, but the overflow is kind of weird. Like if you have trailing spaces, it just doesn't work. And if you have leading white space, it just loses the carry. Like the Z gets cast to an A, and then the carry just gets lost because it's like, oh, we hit there's no more characters to like change, and then we hit the beginning of the string. So I don't know why. Like why not? So here, so we're just having a string, which is 4y6, and we just incremented it 100 times, and obviously what you would expect would be a string, but no, you get a float. The reason for that is because, well, yeah, like why? The reason for that is during this iteration, you get to the process which is like 5d9. When you increment this, you will get 5e0. But 5e0 is a numeric string, so this gets cast to a floating point, and then you get back to 50. Array offsets are a bit tricky. So integer string keys get cast to an integer, but normal numeric strings does not. So yeah, these are all valid string keys, and it gives you this. So yeah, like your integer string key, like the 2 as a string gets cast, and you get like index 2. But like if you have leading zeros, it will not do this. And like you can actually have an empty string as a key. This is actually a valid thing. So when you type juggle, so null, false, and true, null gets cast to an empty string, which is probably the only point in time when you can actually have an integer or a string. Null gets cast to an empty string. False gets cast to 0. 1 gets cast to true. You can use floating point numbers and a string. In this case, the float will have a warning to be that like, oh, you are like trimming the float to get like an integer, and the string, it just doesn't do anything, but it's perfectly fine with a string offset. You can actually use resources as array keys. I know Symfony does this with like database handlers, which is kind of worrying, but it's fine. I think a lot of people used to do this with curl handlers as well. So actually, that's why you can actually cast a curl handler object to an integer to support this kinds of shenanigans. But you can't use like an array as an offset key, nor an object, even if your object implements the toString method, it will just not work. Yeah, this is actually pretty boring. Unset is not. It's just, yeah, like unset does the same thing. You can unset like a resource. You cannot do with like a type. You cannot do with like an object. Isset does kind of the same thing. You just get, it all just works. You'll get like some of the warnings and same type errors. So, you know, it's pretty sensible. Is that like, if it doesn't work, you'll get a type error. If it works, but it has a warning, it emits a warning. So it's kind of just consistent with like all of the array offsets and everything. String offsets, so we just have a string, which is the alphabet. The 6th offset corresponds to the 7th letter, which is G. You can obviously dump it, like null gets cast to 0, but it will like tell you a warning. The same with false, same with true. Actually, like PHP is actually telling you what you're doing is not great, so actually warning you all the time. Same thing with floating point numbers, regardless of if it's integer or not. And yeah, even the same thing with strings. So, but then it kind of works with numerics. So, but like it will accept 2 and 007, but it will not accept 19.0. Although it will accept a float, which is 19.0, and it will just not accept like any random string. So you'll just get errors. And yeah, same thing with like arrays, resources, objects. You cannot accept those as a string offsets. You cannot also unset a string offset. That would be weird. Like, what would be the resulting string? However, the message you get is different depending on like what you're trying to do. Like, if you're trying to access multiple offsets, then you get a different error. PHP is just slightly confused there. And compared to array offsets, where when you were doing something which the engine did not expect, it will actually commit, like it would emit a warning. For string offsets, it just doesn't care. It just doesn't care. And we'll tell you everything is fine, even for offsets which would produce a type error. So it just tells you it exists. And so isset and the null Carlson's operator should be identical, but clearly that like they don't really work that way in PHP, in that like some of them emit type errors, but not others. So yeah, that's also an inconsistency, which is not great, which makes me cry because I care about everything to be expected and logical and normal. So yeah, last bit, we're getting to the end. Exit accepts either an integer or a string, which is surprise number 1. So if you pass it as like an integer, it will just exit with status code 10. If you pass it a string, it will print the string and exit the program with status code 0, which usually for a CLI script, which means everything is okay. However, if the value is not an integer, then exit will interpret it as a string. So null gets interpreted as an empty string, false gets also interpreted as an empty string, true gets interpreted as a string 1, and 15.0 gets interpreted as a string 15. Now, this was mind-boggling to me. I lost a solid day trying to debug a CLI script in CI because I had a variable called has errors in my script, and then I was being like, well, obviously, I have something which is false. So if I have no errors, then status code 0. So pass the thing, and if you have an error, you cast it to 1 and something. And it's very obnoxious to try to debug this because you don't get any output. Like, you just get an empty thing, and then the CI is like pipeline failed. No reason whatsoever. So that took me a while. It turns out I needed an integer cast before it, which is slightly annoying. But yeah, if the value is not an integer, then exit will try to interpret it as a string still. So yeah, exit will print you the warning and then the array. Resource will cast a resource to a string. However, it still emit type errors since 8.0 because they've got some slight changes in how exit behaves. But yeah, so if you actually pass in a non-stringable object to exit, you can actually try catch it and escape the exit. So yeah. So now we went through all of these type juggling contexts, all of those. So which type juggling context does strict type actually affect? It only affects the function type juggling context. Everything else is not unchanged. So strict types is only enabled in PHP script that uses the declare strict type equals 1 declare. And disable coercions of scalar types in the following cases only. Argument passed to a function call made in userland, return values for user-defined functions, value assignments to a type property. So strict type does not change the behavior of the binary operations, so you can still add integers and strings and concatenate booleans with strings. Nor comparisons, so you still get the weird 014 is an octal, so it's not equal to 14. I should have maybe clarified this. It's a bad example. It also does not change the behavior of exit. So you can still do exit true, and it will just cast 1, and you still don't get any errors. It also does not change the behavior of functions that are actually called by the engine. So you might have a function which is just okay, I take an integer, and if it's divisible by 2, so if it's even, return false. If it's true, return if it's odd, then you return true. And then I use array filter with an array which has strings, integers, numeric strings, all of this. And when you pass it, even though you use declare strict type, the engine will disregard this and call the function with weak typing mode enabled. So it will just translate the string 1 as an integer 1 and tell you, okay, this is even, return true. And we'll just accept all of the inputs and not return a type error. Whereas if you implemented a userland variant of array filter, you would get a type error if you use strict types. So yeah, this is the hot take. I think strict types was possibly a mistake, and I'm trying to fix it. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Super interesting. It's nice to see that PHP supports a bunch of stuff that I wouldn't even think of doing.
Yeah, I have more of these examples.
I'm sure you do. So basically, is the only way to have strict types to use some sort of static analysis tool then at the moment in PHP?
Yeah, basically.
Right, okay.
My opinion is basically when strict types were introduced in PHP 7.0, with all of the other scalar types, I don't really understand why, because again, it was before my time, and I don't really understand the politics of internals. But one other proposal which were made by the people at Zend was to actually fix a bunch of these behaviors, but it would just be we'll give at least 5 years of migration for people to fix all of the issues. Like you would have warnings, but it would not have been incompatible with a strict type mode, which would have type errored at the same cases. So you would basically have the conversions from like floats to integer when they lose precision were actually part of that proposal, which would have landed in PHP 7. So we would actually be rid of this issue in PHP 8 if this got to pass, but this didn't for reasons I don't really understand. And I found strict types to be this really massive, effective band-aid that people just slapped on everything, not really understanding what it does. And it does help you prevent some of the issues. Like if you say like, oh, I take a function that wants 2 integers and you then compare them, or like you will not get the weird stuff with like, oh, for example, you have a numeric string or stuff because it will be typecast before. And because you use strict types, you'll get a type error at this point in time. So you could make PHP very strict, but you would need to define like compare integer, compare floats, like as a userland function and call those instead of doing that, like the normal operators. But yeah.
Right. Okay. Is there any question? Yes.
Thank you for that. I'm just curious that you mentioned PHP 9 a few times. Is there many changes coming to the type declaration in PHP 9? And do you know when?
To type declarations, not really. PHP 9 is no official date. Frankly, I don't. Some people wanted like sooner rather than later because it would get rid of a lot of warnings. For example, if you use an undefined variable, that would be an error or an exception instead of a warning. The array type, like casting to string, would also be an error. We would basically promote a bunch of warnings to errors in the same way as we did with PHP 8.0. I kind of would like want a year more so I can try and fix comparisons because I find them baffling. That was initially my plan for this year, but I got sidetracked in a rabbit hole which is called array object and the array access interface and how all of this works and all of the offset stuff, which is weird. But there doesn't seem to be like the biggest reason I feel why we would go for PHP 9 would be converting streams to an object. So every person that does like is resource as a call would like have a migration problem, or we implement a hack to circumvent this. This would probably be the biggest reason to move from one to the other. But it's a massive undertaking. The stream layer in PHP is one of the oldest parts. PHP just became 29 years old. You can imagine how a legacy code base from like 25 years ago looks like in C. It's not pretty. That's one of the reasons. So yeah, I don't know when PHP 9 will happen. Clearly not this year because the next version is PHP 8.4. Maybe next year. I would still hope for PHP 8.5 so that it will also allow people to move to the 8 major release cycle for a bit longer before yet again needing to do a massive upgrade. Or the other reason why we might push like for PHP 9 is if Arnaud actually manages to crack like how to do generics, but some of the changes that would be required would possibly that like class autoloading happens earlier than what happens now. So it will try to do it at compile time. So when you compile the file, it will try to like load all of the classes that it can use. Whereas currently it's only when you actually use the file that it happens. So yeah,
Thank you.
That was going to be my next question, actually, if generics are actually going to happen or not. Any other questions? And by the way, if you're watching this online, you can ask questions using the chat box as well. Any questions? Anybody online? No?
I can answer the generics one if you want a bit more. But,
go for it, yes.
Yeah, so generics is interesting so generics are a hard problem, but in some sense, they are like the easier problem out of the two that PHP has, is that performance and having them be quickly and have a good user experience be the thing. Like a lot of I don't exactly know why, but a lot of people within the interns community would kind of hate that you would need to do every time you want to instantiate a collection object, you would need to do like new collection bracket, the type of your collection, close bracket, do it. Because then you wouldn't need to do any type inference of like what the generic type is. But people think that this is very clunky and that like the inference would like, it needs to be better, like already baked in. Which requires a lot of other changes and like performance optimization, because then you get into like, how do you guess the correct type in advance? You might, for example, if you have a class like an interface like animal and you implement dogs and cats, if you create a collection of type, like we're passing a dog, do you want a collection of dogs or do you want a collection of animals?
Right.
So what happens if you try to add a cat to this collection? Should this type error or should this accept it and just like change the type of the collection to something more generic? So these are the sort of weird issues that we're dealing with generics if we're trying to not be explicit. And the other thing, is performance and how to have the type check not be slow every time you use them. Sure, because PHP, I think it's a good thing, actually does the type checking at runtime. I find it very frustrating every time I need to go back to Python and there is some error somewhere and I get a stack trace deep with like 20 calls because my value just passed in fine for like, I don't know how many times, and then it breaks at the end. It's very hard to debug, I find. So yeah.
But in the meantime, if you really want to use generics, I guess you can always use doc blocks and PHP stan or something like that.
Yeah, you can use PHP stan or Psalm or Fan or Exacat or so many static analyzers actually in PHP.
Any other questions? I've got one actually. What's the anime you keep referring to?
It's called Hibike Euphonium or Sound Euphonium in English. It's actually one of my favorite animes. Actually, the third season is actually airing now, but I haven't watched it. So is it truly my favorite anime? I don't know. But it's basically about a high school orchestra and the drama and like interpersonal relationship. I find it quite good, but yeah.
Right. Okay, I think I'll look it up then. Any other questions? No, nobody? All right, I think we're gonna stop here then. Let's get another round of applause for Gina.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So that was fun.
It was a pleasure. I don't think I've got anything else to tell you in terms of slides. You covered everything, Charlie, earlier, so that's perfect. I think we're going to wrap it up. There's still a few drinks left, so if you guys want to hang out for a bit, you can. I'm not sure there's any pizza left, though. But otherwise, yeah, thank you all for coming, and have a good one, and hopefully see you next time. Take care.
Bye.